Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our second History for Lunch for the month of August. It's hard to believe we're already on August the 20th. July the 20th. Wow, I'm really pushing it today. Sorry about that. I think I got school on my mind. But anyway, we would like to welcome you. But yes, it is hard to believe we're on July the 20th already. But we are delighted to have with us today Paul Vincent. Paul Vincent works with us here at the Museum of the Albemarle. But first, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Don Pendergraft, our director here at the museum, and let him say a few words about Paul and his book. So, Don, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you and welcome to the museum. I'd just like to say the museum is celebrating 55 years of existence. We started in 1967 in a highway patrol station on 17 that's now a dog grooming parlor and supply house. But we have kind of upscaled in the last 55 years to be here, and through the time I've been here about 30 years of that. And I started here as a curator, exhibit designer, collection person. But back in those days, there were only about 3 of us on staff. And through that time, as looking through the collection, we had a flat file. And in the flat file, there were many photographs of this region, and with concentration on Elizabeth City. There were photographs that had been taken from 1870s to the present. And many of those were of boats that had been built here, of shipyards over Riverside. A lot of obscure people that no one remembered who they were, and a lot of locations have changed. In the last several years, Paul Vincent has been able to go through and collect the photographs in the collection and put them into a book format. And today, he's here to talk a little bit about Maritime, Elizabeth City. The museum has seen a lot of changes, and Elizabeth City has been part of those changes. The changes that occurred really happened because of the ways that we travel. When you live in a place that's half land and half water, and you're building boats, a developmental thing happens through the years. And as cars got to be more prevalent with, well, the trains first, the cars, steam engines, we really have changed the way we use boats. Boats are used here more as a recreational means. Paul will talk about that today a little bit with the mothboats and the way they're developed and the way people are using them. But it's a pleasure to know Paul. He's a good researcher. He knows how to find things and finds them quickly. About a year ago, he said, Don, would you please write a foreword for my book? And I said, I wouldn't know what to write, Paul. He said, well, just write something. So he gave me an opportunity to be part of the book, and I really appreciate that. So today, Paul will go through some of his photos that he's compiled into the book and give you a better, more insightful view of what he's done. So thank you very much, and here's Paul.
Howdy. Yep, I'm Paul. I'm a janitor here at the Museum of the Albemarle, but I'm also a historic researcher and writer for the museum. And I'll just start by saying that I appreciate the staff, all the museum staff, for helping me in their own way help me put this book together. Everybody here on staff had a hand, so I thank you for that. A little nervous, but as a friend I've got here today usually tells me, just don't get excited. So I'm going to try to do that. So, just give me a moment. I set the clock here. I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes, as I will go on rambling if I don't. We'll get the screen up with the slides. get started. There. So this book came about from, I'll say to begin with, a conversation I had with Miss Mary Temple in the museum shop. And I asked her, I went in there one day, and I asked her, we have all of our visitors come in and they come to see the galleries upstairs and the traveling exhibits, and then they make their way into your museum shop, and then they look at all the books and all the topics that we have in stock. And I say, when you get questions about what people want to know about this region, Elizabeth City, what are they asking about? What's left? And she says there's two things that people are still interested in wanting to learn more about. One is the Elizabeth City shipyard, and the other one is about monopolies. And I said, I'll work with that. And for about a year and a half, I delved into the collections, archival collections here at the museum, and so this is Maritime Elizabeth City is the product of that conversation. Get some notes here. So we'll start and okay. We'll start here, and this is the way that the harbor looked around the turn of the century. This is the Norfolk and Southern Wharf and Rail Yards. Norfolk and Southern Railroad came to Elizabeth City in 1881, and by the turn of the century, they built what you see here, their rail lines that come up right to the water's edge. On the right-hand side, you can see the freight shed, and this picture is taken from the adjacent storage warehouse. And what you can't see behind is where the roundhouse would have been to change out the trains. Great deal of cargo and goods, cargo being shipped in, passengers coming in, goods being shipped out. In the far background, the lumber blade, the Foreman Blades Lumber Company. They cut and finished lumber. They would put it on these rail cars, shipped it out across the eastern coast up north and across the country. And then you also had a great deal of seafood come right up from the around the sounds, come through the river, past Pink River, right up to the freight shed. They would have gotten their ice from the Crystal Ice and Coal Company that was also located right on the water's edge. Globe Fish Company, which we'll talk about, located not far from the rail lines either. So this was a very industrious port city in the early 20th century. Globe Fish Company was started in 1911 by Ezekiel Daniels, and it's at the time was one of the biggest seafood processing companies on the East Coast here in the state. The Hattie Creek is a well-known boat around these parts, and her sister ship, the Pompano, would haul their catches from Roanoke Island, from Wanchese, on what was called the Wanchese line, bring it up to Elizabeth City, and they would pack it, ice it, again put it on Norfolk and Southern's rail lines, and ship it out. A 1901 figure in one of the local newspapers stated that the previous year they had boxed and packed almost 34,500 units of fish and shellfish, including mussels and clams. I also had a great deal of transportation, water-based transportation. This is the General Lee, as it was docked, I believe, at Matthew Street, which is now Colonial. Is that So, and this is 1909. This ship was originally bought from the Rock Creek Steamboat Company in Baltimore, named the Rock Creek. They renamed it the General Lee, and then that was about 1907. And this ship at the time was ferrying passengers from the, they were ferrying passengers that were attending the Jamestown Exposition that year, 1907. But it comes to Elizabeth City, and by 1909, it is ferrying passengers from port here down to parts in lower Currituck County. It's purchased the next year. It's taken down to Alabama, and unfortunately, at the end of that year, in December, it burns at its wharf. Also, a great deal of shipbuilding in the area. This is the Willey Shipyard from around the turn of the century. Edward S. Willey, he started his shipbuilding enterprise in 1890, and this picture is of his operation along what's today Riverside Avenue, and that's where they're building tugs at the time. He passes the business on to his son, Howard A. Willey, who then will pass it on to his son, Dorr Willey. And some of you may have remembered the Riverside Boat Works, and it was across the Charles Creek. That's where they were set up. This is the USS DuPont. This was a torpedo boat. It was built in 1897. The crew are the 5th Division Naval Reserves out of Elizabeth City, that in 1910 they were given command of the ship to practice. It was a reserve unit, and boys, the teenagers, like when this picture was taken, the future governor of North Carolina, J.C.B. Ehrenhaus, and Percy Farabee, who later moved to the western part of the state and became involved in the state politics, were reserve members of that division. They are, so in 1910 they were given command and for training maneuvers and exercises. So it came through Elizabeth City. You can tell sort of in the background the what I call the landmark at this point in the early part of the harbor, the Norfolk and Southern freight shed and the warehouse. This is a postcard, picturesque postcard view of the Pasquotank River and the harbor, looking across from about Riverside Avenue, about 1922. At this time, you can see a difference in the, not much of one, but the skyline of the city. It's being replaced with larger brick buildings from the wooden oyster houses and railways that existed at the time. Over in the right background is one of the bridges that span the river over into Camden County. This is the Tamarack, and this picture was taken about 1922. This ship started its life built in 1913 in New York, Morris Heights. It was a 119-foot pleasure vessel called the Bluebird. And over the next decade, about next decade, it would change hands, would end up with the well-known automobile manufacturer, Henry Ford. He purchased it and keeps it for about a year, and then it is bought by a wealthy Detroit surgeon, Dr. Torrey, and he will rename it the Tamarack. I'll say briefly that it took a little more research to figure out which Tamarack, because over the course of his life, he owned 4 different boats that he all named the Tamarack. So this one was the Tamarack 2 for him. And so the story with this boat, and as you can see, it is sitting at the edge of East Bering Street behind the Robinson Building, and with Texaco Petroleum Products Building in the background. In December 1921, Dr. Torrey and his party would go to the Pea Island Club on Pea Island for hunting. When they leave there on the evening of December 4th, there's a fire breaks out in the engine room, which we believe was caused by a spark from one of the dynamos, and it burns down to the water line. All hands were safely rescued off the ship from 4 different U.S. Coast Guard life-saving stations, including the all indigenous and African American Pea Island crew. And later in 1922, Miles Clark has the ship dredged, brought back to Elizabeth City, is repaired, and he turns it into an oil tanker to serve his Texas Oil Company fleet. And it serves until 1935, and it's sent up north. It's a very interesting story of born as a palatial yacht, but then comes to serve as an oil tanker. This is the Pasquotank River Bridge, taken about 1931. This is from the Miles Clark collection that we have. This is near the end of its construction. And the Pasquotank River Bridge was first built started construction in 1930. It's part of State Highway NC 34. At that time, it was approved by the State Highway Commission in March of 1930, and it replaced an older rolling block bridge. The Atlantic Bridge Company of Greensboro won the bid on the job to construct it at a cost of $348,057.50. And at this time, I think the newspaper reports had said there was a wooden through traffic artery, and I believe that is what you see in front of the bridge before they demolished it, and it went in full service. All right. This is some of the crew and the captain of the James Adams Floating Theater when it was docked in Elizabeth City in about 1938. Elizabeth City held a place of pride with the James Adams Floating Theater. It was its off-season anchorage and winter port, home port. And what you see here, it was moved by 2 large tugs, and the men are standing on one of the tugs named Trooper. And the man that you see at left is the captain, that is Milford Seymour. His mother, Nina Howard, had purchased the floating theater in 1933, renamed it the original Showboat, and put him in charge of management. And it's very nice to have a personal local picture of such a well-known vessel here in our collection, it being the inspiration for Edna Ferber's Showboat. This is the girls' national picture taken from the girls' national championship race in 1933 out on the Pasquotank River. 1933 was the first year of the National Mothboat Regatta, and Captain Joel Van Zandt had designed this little vessel in 1929 at the Elizabeth City Shipyard with help of Ernest Sanders and Harry O'Neill. This would lead, he's originally from New Jersey, and this would lead to interclub, what they call interclub races in 1930 between the Pasquotank River Yacht Club and the Evening Star Yacht Club in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And by 1933, it had such a following that they started the first national mothboat regatta that year. And of these three girls, the two on the left, Carolyn and Arletta, are the daughters of Joe Van Zandt, and then Helen Hill and they were members of the Atlantic City Evening Star Yacht Club, and Helen Hill is racing them for the Pasquotank River Yacht Club. This is a promotional poster from about 1940 advertising Elizabeth City and all of its what offers to tourism and life and culture for those who may be interested in coming to visit or live. The girl that's posing at left is Violet Cohoon, and she's about 20 years old in this picture, and it's just a nice promotional for the city. Below, the picture below, that's more of the Robinson building that originally stood there between East Farian and Church Streets. And then above you can see in the background of that picture is the shipyard and the yacht basin. And the picture above is one of the mothboat regattas being raced. Here we have a U.S. Coast Guard rescue boat that was built by the Elizabeth City Shipyard in 1940. They won a bid the previous year to build from the Coast Guard 10 of these vessels at their yard for $2,700 a piece. The ship was 30 feet in length, 9 feet wide, and it sported a 225 horsepower Kermath Seawolf motor. The chief architect, naval architect, Alfred Hansen, was on hand to observe the test trials for this vessel in July of 1940. He ultimately approved, and he commended the shipyard in their work. And so this is one of their vessels they crafted and to use for service in the Coast Guard. Looks great. Another contract that they were awarded later, at the beginning of the war, from 1941 and 1943, the Elizabeth City Shipyard would ultimately build 30 110-foot submarine chasers. And these were used for chasing the submarines. I will say of the five that you see here, I can make mention. Submarine chasers had previously been built during World War I, and they were given a SC prefix for subchaser. Now, when the Second World War comes around and they start producing a larger version, they go for they wanted to differentiate between the two. Their World War I predecessors they would call with the letter prefix PC. The U.S. Navy would eventually come to build a 173-foot steel-hulled patrol boat, and these are wooden-hulled, the subchasers, so they went back to an SC designation. And so there's images we have in our collection that show both an SC and PC letter prefix. Of these, though, that are listed, that are docked here at the shipyard, February 22nd, 1943, SC 1279 would eventually rescue all hands aboard a merchant ship, the SS Maltran, after an attack from the German U-boat U-759. And SC 1277 would eventually be transferred to the Coast and Geodetic Survey following the war. I had something else, but I can't remember the time. I had it, and I lost it. This is the P.K. Hunt. This is the shipyard's first modern commercial fishing trawler, built in 1946. This was built for Powhatan King Hunt, who was the founder of P.K. Hunt and Sons. He was a seafood processing company up in Virginia. Built at a cost of $75,000. It had all the modern amenities, electric range, refrigerator, navigation. This ship would be put in service for the next almost 20 years until it, fishing about 40 miles off the coast of Cape May, it caught fire and burned. Charles McNaughton, past member of Eureka Lodge, Masonic Lodge in Elizabeth City. He's from Millerstown, Pennsylvania. He comes to Elizabeth City after the war, gets into powerboat racing in the late 40s, and by 1950, he is organizing his own powerboat races out on the Pasquotank River. And these would lead eventually to larger gatherings in races, powerboat races, in the 1950s that culminates in 1954 with the International Cup. And that cup was raced by the largest powerboats, the hydrofoils, called Unlimiteds. And those were hydroplane powerboats that sported a V12 Allison engine that were found in P-51 Mustangs, huge, and brought out a lot of spectators, a lot of visitors to Elizabeth City in the mid-50s, early and mid-50s. Sometimes 40 to 50,000 spectators would come to see these races. And Frank McNaughton had a part in that. And this is him in his boat, the High Spray, and it's taken by Jack Williams, a pretty well-known photographer for his time in Elizabeth City, 1953. Frank McNaughton also managed McNaughton Motors, which was a marine supply and engine business that was on Water Street in the 50s, starting 1950 and through the 60s. And that way he also helped support the powerboat racing community through his expertise, his business acumen. This is one of the unlimited powerboats that was raced was on the Pasquotank River in Elizabeth City. This is the Miss US 4, and you can see the cover off in the large V12 engine they're working on the docks. And in 1957, the International Cup Regatta was raced by this one hydroplane. There would usually be about a dozen that would show up to these races. This one, because of the scheduling conflict by the American Powerboat Association, there was another race in Indiana that the rest of the entries had decided to enter into that race. And so by default, George Simon owned the Miss US 4, and Bob Rowland of South Norfolk made one 15-lap heat on the river, came back and was awarded the trophy. And the previous year, George Simon's Miss US 1 took the trophy. These boats could cost anywhere between $100,000 to $250,000 to build and maintain, so it was it was quite a sport to be a part of, and they raced hard. This is a view of South Water Street looking north, taken July 7th, 1958. As you can see on the right is part of the old Robinson building that is long since gone. That is present day Mariners Wharf. Some of the other businesses you can see at Hurdle Hardware on the right, and on the left where current day Cypress Creek Grill and the Senior Sewing Center is. That's where Comstocks and Hoover Brothers are located further up on the left. Way in the foreground, in the background, you can is where the older industries like the Crystal Ice and Coal Company and Globefish Company, which was still operating at this time. Globefish was until the 60s, located further down. Miles Clark, with his the Texas Oil Company, but with his business and his business acumen, he gave a lot back to Elizabeth City, and was a big supporter of the Elizabeth City High School band. I remember Miss Lori talking, she being part of the high school band, that even years later, his name was still being used, Uncle Miles, and that's what he was known. And but he ends up passing in May of 1965, but he's still well remembered here in the city for what he was able to give back to the community in his time. This is a shot of the Coastal Warning Defense, Coastal Warning Tower at the foot of East Beering Street. This was taken about 1967. The Coastal Warning Display Towers were part of an initiative put forth by the McKinley administration back during the turn of the century, and they used a combination of signal flags and lights at night to alert severe weather conditions for those out on the river or at sea. Manteo still has theirs standing, and I believe Southport had theirs. It was came down in a storm, but they are attempting to rebuild it. Elizabeth City, I think, lost theirs around the early 1980s, but here it still stands. It was erected in 1904, and right now, with the flags you see flying, it is showing a gale warning in effect. The National Weather Service would eventually deactivate their coastal warning network in 1989. Some coastal cities, especially those in North Carolina, opted to keep theirs. And I will say there's a sign that we have in collections on display in our store right now that is the U.S. Weather Bureau identifying marker, and it's just visible near the bottom of the tower here, and we have that on display right now. The Rose Buddies. This is a shot of Joe Kramer and Fred Faring at one of their parties in 1984. They would start the year before, in '83, but they wanted to welcome incoming voters at the Mariners Wharf, and so they would bring in snacks, and Joe Kramer would bring in his rose blossoms, and his bushes after his death were taken over to Mariners Wharf, where they grow today. And so this is a well-known maritime custom that is still practiced today, and is taken up by the Visit Elizabeth City, the Visitors Bureau. They still welcome voters today. This is a shot of a few of the Museum of Albemarle staff at the 1989 Classic Mothboat Regatta. By the early 1970s, the mothboat regattas that were so big in the 30s and the 40s had waned. In 1972, the International Moth Class Association, which had been centralized in the United States, disbanded, and so they became separate companies, separate countries would develop their own associations. And the mothboat regattas, those races, they dwindled, but there was a renewed interest in the late 80s to bring back the classic mothboat regatta. And so from that time through to the end of the 20th century, the Museum of the Albemarle was a big supporter and put a lot of work into bringing those races back. And I'll just say the young lady that's on the left there is our own Lynette Sawyer, and we love her. And it's nice to see that she's still with us, but that's her with Denise Irby, and Candace Perry is standing, and Mary Chirac there at that regatta. This is Mariner's Wharf, obviously submerged underwater. It was taken September 16th, 1999, in the wake of Hurricane Floyd. The hurricane estimated to be 580 miles across. Its eye passed right over Elizabeth City. There was a 6-foot storm tide that, by newspaper reports, claimed that about 8 blocks of downtown were flooded. Floyd had deposited over 2.5 inches of rain, and the Coast Guard base had recorded a sustained wind speed of 39 miles an hour. You can see there at the right, those are the tops of the pilings for the boat slips there at Mariner's Wharf. Hurricane Floyd was one of the worst hurricanes to hit North Carolina, and some 51 people had lost their lives in its wake. This here is our building that you're in now, Elizabeth, the Museum of the Albemarle. This is in the midst of its construction in August 2002. And as Don had said, we're in our 55th year. Started out there on South 17, and by the late 80s there was talk about bringing the museum into new quarters, and so in 1988 there was plans to construct this building. City Council had donated about 2 acres of land where Davenport Motors and the old Coca-Cola plant once sat, and we've been here ever since, and we'll keep it going. 6 minutes to go, but before I finish out, I'll let Don come up here to talk about our latest exhibit that'll debut later this year.
Before we get into the questions and answers, I'd just like to say thank you, Paul. You've done a great job. But we are promoting our next big exhibit. It's called Rock of the Eye, and it's about the boat building that's been around the Albemarle Sound for 400 years. And if you take in the indigenous people, it's 12,000 years. There's been a lot of boats built here, and the exhibit will talk about all aspects of what's happened here as far as Madam Mesquite or Tide County and things that have happened in the way of boat building. This is George Washington Creek, considered the father of the shad boat. He is the man that trained Elvira Wright, we think, to build shad boats also. And that's the boat that hangs in our lobby, the Albemarle Right Shad boat. But it opens to the membership on October the 10th. We'll have a reception. I think Barbara Putnam's planning a charcuterie board, and everybody's really excited about it. So I want you to be here that night to be part of it. It's going to be fun. We're going to have Joan Maxwell here from Regulator Marine in Edenton. She's going to talk about building the new boats that they're building there. All her boats have no wood in them. They're all composition and fiberglass and just beautiful, beautiful boats. So thank you, Paul. Finish up, and I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. If we have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them as best I can.
Paul, one of your early pictures was the rail yard.
Yes, sir.
Where was that located?
So I will scroll back.
Yeah, I'm sorry to make you go
No,
back that far.
Not bad.
Yeah.
So, the rail yard is that's current day Mid-Atlantic Christian University.
Okay, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
So that's their administration and buildings and classroom. That is where you see here. And I had meant to mention earlier that the road on the far left over there, that's Pennsylvania Avenue. That's current day North Poindexter Street. There are about 161 images in the book. This is just a selection. What we went over due to time today, but I hope you enjoyed these images, and I hope that you might have seen an image you haven't seen before. And so we're all about getting them out into to the community and helping educate. That's just what we do. If there are no other questions, though, I thank you again, and appreciate everybody being here today. Thank you very much.
Again, we would like to thank Paul for being our guest speaker today. And if you are interested